Thank you, and welcome to now our keynote address. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Anna Busse Berger, who's one of our most distinguished alumni from Boston University. She has 1986, I will even point out. She's published articles and books on notation, mensuration and proportion signs, music and memory, mathematics and music, historiography, and music in African mission stations. The interdisciplinary nature of her work has made her the recipient of major awards from scholarly societies representing the three musicological disciplines: the American Musicological Society, Society for Music Theory, and Society for Ethnomusicology. She's the winner of the Albert Einstein Award from the American Musicological Society for the best article by a young scholar. She's had fellowships at the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies, Villa Itati, twice, the Guggenheim Foundation, the NEH Stanford Humanities Center, the University of Vienna, and the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin. Her books include Mensuration and Proportion Signs, Medieval Music and the Art of Memory, which won the ASCAP Deems-Taylor Award and the Wallace-Berry Award from the Society of Music Theory. Her article, Spreading the Gospel of Singbewegung, an ethnomusicologist missionary in Tanganyika of the 1930s, won both the Collinston Award for Best Article by a senior scholar from the AMS and the Bruno Nettle Prize from the Society for Ethnomusicology in 2014. Her book, entitled The Search for Medieval Music in Africa and Germany, 1891-1961, Scholars, Singers, and Missionaries from the University of Chicago Press in 2020, won the Bruno Nettle Award from the Society for Ethnomusicology for 2021. And if that is not enough, she is also the co-editor of the Jesse Roden of the Cambridge History of 15th Century Music. Anna, it is a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you so much for this invitation. You cannot imagine my surprise when I received it. BU has changed unbelievably since 1986. That there is a ethnomusicologist running the School of Music. It boggles.
Your head explodes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what the guys I studied with would think or would say about this development. It's just wonderful. But thank you very much. So, Erich Moritz von Hornbostel, this is the first PowerPoint, one of the founders of comparative musicology, was passionately interested in medieval music because he believed it had a lot in common with music and so-called primitive cultures. He and his students drew parallels between medieval church modes and African scales. They described improvisation techniques which they believed both cultures shared. And Hornbostel called Vanyamyesi polyphony organum and drew a parallel to the 9th century treatise Musica Inquirientes. Even though Hornbostel advocated the singing of local music in his groundbreaking article from 1928, African Negro Music, he also recommended Gregorian chant and medieval polyphony as a second best alternative for missionaries in Africa. As a result, many German missionaries in East Africa introduced Gregorian chant and early polyphony to the African congregations in the firm belief that it was closer to the music sung in Africa. Today, I want to tell the story of a small but highly successful German mission society close to Bielefeld that took a completely different path from all the others. The event that triggered this different path was a speech by the unknown African music scholar Nicolas Ballanta at the International Mission Society meeting in LeZoute in Belgium in 1926. Now, new PowerPoint. By all accounts, Ballanta was adamant that African music had nothing in common with medieval music and medieval polyphony. He strongly recommended that missionaries let Africans sing their own music. All of this happened 2 years before Hornbostel's famous article. Bethel Mission is one of the smaller Lutheran mission societies, yet it had a huge influence on German religious life in the late 19th and early 20th century, and altogether 20th century. The Bodelschwing family, new PowerPoint, that stood behind the Bethel Mission had an almost saint-like reputation in Germany, and that they were intimately associated with helping the mentally handicapped, the homeless, and eventually underprivileged Africans. The fact that no Bethel patient was killed in the Nazi euthanasia program during the war, and that Fritz von Bodelschwingh, the son of this founder, Friedrich von Bodelschwingh, was one of the leaders of the confessing church, the Lutheran church that stood in opposition to Hitler, further contributed to Bethel's reputation. The original mission society was founded after Prussia took possession of Dar es Salaam and called the mainland Deutsch Ostafrika. Now, PowerPoint, there you see a map of it. The person behind this action was the German colonial explorer Karl Peters, founder of the German East Africa Company, one of the most cruel explorers in history. His cruelty was such that he was called back to Berlin and eventually deprived of his commission and lost all pensions. He was also in prison for some time. After Tanganyika became a German colony, German Vice Chancellor Otto von Bismarck insisted that all mission societies in German East Africa were German. So the Anglicans who were there before had to leave. Friedrich von Bodelschwingh was a member of Westphalian nobility with close links to the Hohenzollern, the imperial family, and he had established the town of Bethel close to Bielefeld in 1872, originally took care only for epileptic patients. But very soon the institution took in mental patients and handicapped people as well as homeless, with the goal to rehabilitate them. Bodelschwingh was a highly charismatic man who was extremely successful in fundraising and lobbying for his institution, so much so that the other mission societies felt threatened by his activities. From the very beginning, Bodelschwingh put his personal stamp on the mission. He personally selected the missionaries with great care. While most other mission societies educated their own missionaries in their schools, his were usually well-educated theologians. Bodelschwingh concentrated on two areas in Tanganyika, the northwest in the Usambara Mountains among the Shamba, and the area around Bukoba west of Lake Victoria among the Haya. So he wanted to get away from Dar es Salaam because he knew the colonial government would be trouble. The reaction of the two tribes to Western music couldn't have been more different. While the Shamba were highly receptive to Western music and were called musical by the missionaries from the very beginning, the Haya were completely unmusical. For this very reason, of course, the missionaries' descriptions of Haya music and their attempts to have the Haya sing Western music are particularly interesting for us. But before we give an account of the musical activities, we need to turn our attention to the mission inspector who was responsible for the work of the missionaries. Next PowerPoint. Mission inspector, I don't know if it's
Trittlewitz.
Yeah, Trittlewitz. Okay, perfect. Mission inspector Walter Trittlewitz was unusual among mission administrators in that he was in charge of the Bethel mission stations for 42 years, from 1897 to 1939. Trittlewitz was also a superb fundraiser and edited journals for children. And that was one journal that was the most popular children magazine in all of Germany, period, in the first half of the 20th century, with 80,000 copies printed every month. And one of the surprising things I discovered while researching my book was that numerous missionaries and anthropologists decided to become missionaries and anthropologists because they read this children's magazine. Until 1926, his musical agenda is conventional. He oversees the publications of hymn books in Shamba and Haya, of German chorales and folk songs, with translations into local languages. The first Buhaya hymn book was mentioned in 1913 and included only German hymns and folk songs. Trittlewitz is such an interesting case because we can observe a radical shift of his attitude towards the music in the mission stations after 1926, when he heard Ballanta at the International Missionary Council meeting. So who was Nicholas Ballanta and how did it happen that Trittlewitz met him? Ballanta is among a small number of African scholars who describes African music in the 1920s. While Hornbostel gave the first description of African music from a Western scholarly perspective, Ballanta tried to do the same from an African point of view. And while Hornbostel's article has really set the agenda for African music research for the next decades, Ballanta's publications have found little to no attention. He anticipates many of the findings of Hornbostel, as well as those of Gerhard Kubik and Sima Arum in the 1960s and 70s. But Ballanta's description of African music differ also in many ways from those of Hornbostel. Ballanta was born in Sierra Leone in 1893 and came to the United States in 1921. After a stay in Boston, where he conducted his own composition called the African Rhapsody in Boston Symphony Hall, he began studying in 1922 with a scholarship at the Institute of Musical Arts, which later became Juilliard, and graduated in 1924. Remarkable is the support he received from three important men: the conductor, Walter Damrosch, his brother Frank Damrosch, who directed the Institute of Musical Arts, and most importantly, the businessman and philanthropist George Foster Peabody. He spent the next year studying African-American music at St. Helena, all funded by Peabody, which resulted in his first publication. But for our purposes, most interesting is the fact that he was the very first recipient of the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship for Music Research in 1925 and 1927, respectively. So he got 2 years in order to collect and evaluate music in Africa. The anthropologist Hans Boas and Henry Fink, a popular music critic, were both undoubtedly friends of Peabody, were referees for Ballanta's Guggenheim application. In preparation for his trip, to Africa, Boas sent him to Hornbostel in Berlin. Peabody also arranged for Ballanta to speak at the Missionary Conference in Belgium, where Tritowitz heard him. Now, I have a short comment here to say on missionaries in America in the first half of the 20th century. There's an excellent book by a Berkeley historian, David Hollinger, called Missionaries Abroad. They were the most progressive forces in America. They were responsible for Amnesty International, Peace Corps, anti-colonialism. They were completely the most admired people in America. And during the Second World War, without missionaries and their children, the State Department would have never gone anywhere because they were the only ones who knew all these languages, Thai, Burmese, and so on. It's a completely interesting book, so I recommend it to all of you. So this is why Peabody sent Ballanta there. Hornbostel's relationship with Ballanta was not a happy one. The correspondence is now in the Berlin Phonogram Archive. Let me summarize the main points. Ballanta received a phonograph from Hornbostel, who expected to get recordings from Ballanta in return. In 1928, Hornbostel inquires where the recordings are. Ballanta claims to have sent them. It is clear that Hornbostel does not believe Ballanta ever sent the recordings. Ballanta repeatedly asked for money, which is denied. And there the correspondence ends. In the 1930s, we see Ballanta as a member of the Advisory Committee on Education of Liberia. In the 1940s and 50s, he taught at a grammar school in Freetown. His death in Sierra Leone in 1962 received only a short obituary notice by Alan Merriam in the American periodical Musicologies. Ballanta has published 3 short articles during his lifetime. The first 2 were written during his time in the US, the last one once he returned to Africa. All 3 papers are published in journals that are difficult to access, if not impossible, and probably were not read by many people. Ballanta's articles are based on research he did with various tribes in West Africa. Like Hornbostel, he's trying to explain to his readers what makes African music so different from European music. Since musicologists had not yet developed a vocabulary to deal with non-Western music, they regularly compared African music to medieval music because medieval music was the only music they knew that was not major or minor. They regularly discovered church modes in Africa and drew a comparison to medieval organum when describing African polyphony. It is astonishing that none of this is found in the writings of Ballanta, even though he received training in the US. Quite the opposite. He says clearly that medieval modes, and now new PowerPoint, are not a useful concept for African music. He writes at the beginning of his first article, One great difference between African music and that of the Caucasian races is that of the leading tone. The African, untouched by European musical influence, does not at any time use the note semitone below as the lower auxiliary note to any principal tone. It is true that some of the ecclesiastical modes possess this peculiarity, but these composers, and that's my underlining, do not write in native African scales, nor does the study of the ecclesiastical modes assist one in his quest for some data to work upon any more than an assiduous study of Greek literature furthers one progress in the mastering of, say, the Mendi language or any other African language, end quote. In other words, Ballanta rejects any parallel to medieval music and believes that African music has to be analyzed in its own terms. This shows Ballanta to be an independent thinker who did not believe that African music was on a lower level than Western music. His description of African rhythm is perceptive and gives an early account of African polyrhythm. Similarly, he stresses the primacy of duple time and finds that other meters, which occur simultaneously, are related to this one beat. Ballanta uses the term cross rhythm to describe what he observes in Yoruba music before A.M. Jones, another missionary. Like Hornbostel, he was a comparative musicologist, and he was particularly interested in the relationship between speech tones and melodic contours. He shows in much greater detail than Hornbostel how dangerous it can be if European missionaries who do not know the language as well, especially if these languages are tonal, set the English hymn to say Yoruba's words next PowerPoint. In example M1, I give a typical line translated from the English hymnal. The tones of the words are suggested by the notes above them and the different meanings assigned to different tones. It is essential that in order to get the precise meaning, the exact intonation should be followed. But when the line was sung to the English hymn tune, a different meaning from what was intended is conveyed. The original text, which the missionary intended to translate, was "Awake my soul and with the sun." The Yoruba text that he created with the intonation of the melody was Ji Okan Mihaoni, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it terribly, which translates as meaning steel, soul of mine, steel in my sleep. Clearly not a text intended by the missionary. Ballanta's main agenda with the tonal system was to explain to Europeans and Americans in what way African scales and melodies differ from European ones. Since he was eager to describe a tonal system that would include all African music, he adds inflections. He observes quarter tone inflections and half tone inflections. It seems likely to me that what he was referring to are the irregular tunings Kubik and others have observed in African xylophones, both in equidistant pentatonic and hexatonic tunings. Because he heard these inflections, he was one of the earliest scholars to argue that the Western notational system was inadequate for African music, since there are many more pitches than this staff can indicate. In sum, Ballanta was the first scholar to state clearly that medieval church modes are not a useful concept for African music. His main goal was to develop a separate set of tools for understanding African music. The Western concept of dissonance and consonance do not apply to African music, no leading tone, and he argued that African rhythm was more developed than European rhythm. Finally, he felt that the Western notational system was inadequate to notate the music you heard in Africa, since there are so many additional inflections. After I read all of his articles, I spent 3 days at the Guggenheim Foundation to read all the letters and documents they had on Ballanta. Very hard to get in there, by the way. Most interesting was the correspondence surrounding Ballanta's unpublished book manuscript, The Aesthetics of African Music. Peabody wanted it published by Oxford University Press. Oxford demanded a competent reviewer for the manuscript, which turned out to be extremely difficult to find. In the end, the manuscript was sent to the comparative musicologist George Herzog, a student of Hornbostel and Boas, who eventually became professor of ethnomusicology in Bloomington, Indiana. Herzog wrote two truly devastating reviews, the likes of which I have never seen in my life. The question is, how serious can we take them? Ballanta's book essentially reiterates much of the material discussed in his articles. In addition, he provides information on instruments and rituals not available elsewhere. Most importantly, he includes 350 transcribed musical examples. In the early 1930s, there were very few examples of African music available, transcriptions, I mean, so this trove of transcriptions alone would have warranted publication. Yet, it is not difficult to understand why Herzog was exasperated by the manuscript. The prose is stilted, even more so than the articles. The problems begin in the preface. He starts with a description of a Bambara flute player who would play a tone somewhere between B flat and B natural, which he, Ballanta, was unable to reproduce on the harmonium. We know from his earlier articles what he was trying to describe was an inflection mentioned above. But the fact that he was trying to match the pitches to the harmonium indicates that he does not realize that there is no such thing as absolute pitch. And of course, Herzog noticed this mistake right away. He criticized him for talking about African music in general. He did not approve of his many transcriptions. In short, Herzog applied the same standard to Ballanta as he would have to an American or German scholar. He could not get himself to support a native scholar, and this is a quote from Herzog's review, who tries to do anthropological work without the proper training, end quote. And yet, many of Herzog's reproaches were unjust. For example, Hornbostel's groundbreaking article, African Negro Music, also talks about African music in general. Similarly, most scholars of Ballanta's generation did transcriptions without indicating which tones are not found in the tonal system. In fact, I found them no worse than those of Hornbostel's student Marius Schneider, whose example of African polyphony were much admired when they appeared. In short, Ballanta's publications, imperfect as they are, reveal information about music in West Africa that cannot be found elsewhere. Herzog had quite a reputation for writing devastating and frequently unjustified reviews. He suffered from a bipolar disorder. To my knowledge, the only student who ever finished a dissertation with him was Bruno Lettel. Yeah. So to quote David McAllister on Herzog as an advisor, the campus was littered with failed Herzog students. So from Ballanta's point of view, and ours, of course, it is most unfortunate that his manuscript was sent to Herzog. It is too bad that it never occurred to Herzog to sit down with Ballanta and help him revise the book manuscript. This is what we would have done today, I think. Peabody gave up on trying to get Ballanta's manuscript published when he read Herzog's devastating reports. Much to his credit, he consulted with Hornbostel, who had to immigrate to the US in 1933 because he was partly Jewish. Hornbostel informed Peabody that he was convinced that Ballanta never set the promised recordings. After that, the correspondence in the Guggenheim Foundation ended. So that's it. And yet, Ballanta left a mark in East Africa. After hearing Ballanta speak at the mission conference, Mission Inspector Tritowitz tried to convince his missionaries to introduce local music. At first, his attempts to introduce African music fell on deaf ears. Virtually all missionaries complained that African music is inferior to Lutheran chorales and the music of Heinrich Schütz and Bach. However, all of this changed in 1929 with the appointment of Otto Hagener, new PowerPoint. Hagener is different from your usual missionary for three reasons. First, he was unusually well educated and could have gone on to a major academic career if he had chosen to do so. Second, he had excellent musical training, which enabled him to understand the Buhaya music better than anyone before him. And third, as we can see from his many letters, he was a genuinely moral man. He showed the same respect to minors with whom he worked before he came to Africa as to his African students. He was opposed to Hitler and an active member of the confessing church. Hagener attended the famous best boarding school in Germany, Schulpforta, close to Naumburg, where Friedrich Nietzsche was also educated. As a result of his classical training, he was able to make a major contribution to the translation of the New Testament from Greek to Haya. So most other missionaries translated from German into the Latin, but he really knew Greek very well. His father was only able to pay for one semester of his theology studies, so he worked in all vacations as a miner or factory worker. Originally, he wanted to work as a pastor with his old friends from the mines, but when he visited Bethel, he decided to go to Africa. After intensive language instruction in London, he studied African languages with Dietrich Westermann at the Institute of Oriental Studies at Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin in 1928. That's now Humboldt University. Hagener arrived in Buhaya in 1929. His immediate task was to found a so-called central school in Kigarama, where young people would be educated as teachers. The next picture. Is this the students?
No.
No, they leave it there. It's a map.
Yes.
Okay, map. Okay. So this is the map of the area where you were. And Kigarama is, you can see that on the map there. Before we start to describe his teaching activities at Kigarama, it is necessary to give some background on what went on before Hagener arrived. While it is normal for missionaries to comment on the inability of the Africans to sing in tune in the first years of their work, the musical abilities of the Haya were generally considered beyond hope. The first Haya missionary, Ernst Johansen, wrote in 1918. The Haya have only the small hymn book by Döring, an earlier missionary, and the songs sound really terrible wherever you hold a service. And he concludes a little later, the people here, in any case, the adults have no ear at all for our melodies. No new PowerPoint. Is this a class? Is this a student?
Yes.
Okay. So look at the student on the left, lower left. Keep an eye on him. We'll talk more about him. In the bottom row, lower left.
Oh, I'm sorry. This might be the
Oh,
the
no,
video.
no, what is that?
This is a video.
So, first of all, yeah, let's listen to the video. It's
Okay.
wonderful. Okay. So, first, I wanted to play a recording of the film African Queen, which starts with Catherine Ephraim as a missionary. And there's this African group, and they sing so horribly, but I thought it's so condescending, I cannot play this. But then I thought when we were in Africa in 2011, we were in the Southern Highlands, and I found a congregation which were unable to sing in anything but pentatonic tuning. So this is a very famous chorale, which I'm sure you all know, and they completely leave out the half step. So let's just listen to that a moment. It's a congregation in Mazoko. Yeah. You hear it, okay? Good. Hagener's task was to study higher music and try to introduce it into the service. In one of his first letters from 1929, he describes the difficulty of translating melodies into Haya, a tonal language. He quickly realized that he did not have the background to introduce local music. So instead, he started to teach them typical 17th and 18th century settings of Lutheran chorales. He really tried, but he couldn't. The results are immediate. In a letter from 1930, he writes to one of his friends, "It is a great pleasure to sing with these boys who were supposedly so unmusical. You will not be able to assemble in every school of 40 kids in a choir that can sing so much in tune in Germany. Approximately 8 students of the upper class are able to write down the notes of a slowly sung melody, and we have even sung Bach chorales," end quote. Now, in the next PowerPoint, there is the future bishop of the Northwest Diocese, Josiah Kibira, and he's on the bottom left. Okay, keep an eye out for him. He became, in 1977, the first Black president of the Lutheran World Lutheran World Federation. This is huge. This is like a black pope, 1977 already. And he was a student of Hagener in the 1920s. And there is little doubt that this is where Kibira's passionate love of German Lutheran music started, a point to which we shall return later. In an unpublished paper, Hagener describes how the congregation comes with their hymn book to every service and gets inspired by the singing of the school choir. As a result, also the entire congregation now wants to sing four-part chorales. Next PowerPoint. All of his letters show that what he would really like to introduce is local music, but he does not know how to do it. And that yet, within a few years, things gradually change. By 1933, Tridowitz already feels comfortable enough to write about the use of local music in the service. Quote, but is it really right that we bring the local population our own music? Why don't we let them use their old African music? For a long time, the missionary thought African music was inappropriate for the Christian service. And for many years, I have begged them again and again, collect the songs of the local population and write the local melodies down. Now this thought is coming up everywhere in Africa, end quote. In 1936, a new church is dedicated in Bukoba, and now African music is performed alongside the typical Bethel brass ensemble. Then the pastor had asked all 8 chiefs of the 8 Haya kingdoms to bring their drums inside the church. The Hayas are famous for their drums. They come in all sizes. Every drummer spoke a Bible passage, then he hit his drum with a few strong beats. How does Hagener describe Haya music? Tridowitz had suggested to him that Haya music is pentatonic. And while Hagener agrees that many songs are indeed pentatonic, he finds that in addition, there are other tonal systems. He attempts to summarize what he hears in 10 points. First, even though much of Haya music is pentatonic, some of the music is so different that he's unable to write it down in staff notation or even repeat a simple melody. Quote, by the way, there is no correct notation and we are far from a correct tonal reproduction of musical reality. The strange falling of the voices, the seeming or real sliding of the voices from the pitch one is on, though they are never pulled down, is unimaginably foreign to us. I have to ask them to sing a succession of 8 tones to me at least 10 times before I can sing it myself, end quote. Second, local people seldom use longer strokes that would allow a close strain of thought. The rule is rather an alternating couplet which is repeated again and again. Thus, strophic chorales are foreign to them. Third, the song of the local population is generally antiphonal, and of course, most chorales are not antiphonal. Fourth, he explains why translation of German chorales into Haya will not work. Quote, the completely different language rhythm of Bantu languages can almost never be translated without violation of the melodies which were created for our German language rhythm. Fifth, the local population do not use melismas in their melodies. And since there are lots of melismas in chorales, they will not work for the Haya. Sixth, the singing tone is produced in a completely different way. The singers do not sing with the head or breast resonance, but the tone is somewhat nasal, which results in a restrained and suspended sound. Seventh, the Haya melodies often end on the third, which increases the suspended character of their singing. Eighth, the range of the local melodies is small, usually not more than 5 tones. Our chorales have a much larger range. Ninth, the Haya does not like to make big leaps. He rarely goes over a third. And 10th, I have the impression, even though I cannot prove it yet, that local singers prefer a falling melody rather than an ascending one. We have then in Hagener a well-educated missionary who observed that even though the majority of African tribes have pentatonic or heptatonic systems, his people in addition use a system with half and quarter steps. Who was aware of the problems of translating German hymns into Haya, a tonal language, who similarly did not believe that the rhythm of the Haya language could be brought in line with translations of German poetry. In short, he brought forth 10 strong arguments against translating German chorales into Haya and advocated local music instead. Most importantly, he gave what amounts to one of the earliest descriptions of higher music. Unfortunately, Hagener did not have any ethnomusicological training and never published his findings on higher music. They are all in the archive. All German missionaries were sent back in 1939 when the war broke out, or Germany started the war. Hagener was a member of the anti-Hitler professing church from 1933 on and wrote many highly critical letters of the Nazi regime to his wife, any one of which could have landed him in a concentration camp. He became an Air Force courier and described in detail the mass killings and mass starvations in the Eastern Front. Nobody really knew about that because soldiers were not allowed to speak, but he did. He died in a plane crash in 1943 on a flight from Vicenza to Munich. So what happened to Lutheran church music in Buhaya after the war? Unfortunately, the legacy of Tridowitz and Hagener was quickly forgotten after Hagener's departure. But in the early 1960s, German church musician Werner Both was, and he's on the next picture, is that guy with the instrument? Okay, yes. Werner Both, he's the person on the right, was sent to Buhaya to build a music school, Rohingya. He had two specialties, early music performance, you won't believe that, and brass ensembles, that was it. No one in Germany thought to give him some ethnomusicological training. Both's job was to make the Haya sing four-part chorales. Well, this did not happen. Both proved to be a passionate apprentice of Haya music. With the strong support of Hagener's old student, now Bishop Josiah Kebira, remember the guy? Both established a music school in Rohingya in 1964. Two African students, Yoas Kijugo and Blasio Mulyova, would regularly visit within the surrounding villages to look for local musicians who would then give them lessons on the various instruments and teach them how to build them. All three of them went to the court of the Kabaka in Kampala and learned how to play and build amadindas and akadindas from Evarista Muyinda. During his sabbatical in 1965, he managed to persuade the mission director to allow him to study ethnomusicology with Mario Schneider, who was then by far the most important ethnomusicologist in Germany, which he found most inspiring. Back to Africa, Both and his students made numerous radio programs on African music between 1961 and 68, mainly from Tanzania, but also from Uganda and Kenya. And they are all now in the Berlin Phonogram Archive, if you're interested in them. They're fantastic, these recordings. Most of this material remains to be analyzed. Next PowerPoint. The reactions of the African church leaders to Both's work is complicated. On the one hand, they were supporting his music school and his efforts. On the other hand, they were Bishop Josiah Kebira belongs to the first generation of African Christians who appreciated Lutheran music. As mentioned above, he was educated by Hagener. He had sung Bach chorales in his choir, composed and conducted Lutheran chorales. He had little understanding for the fact that Both traveled around to record local music and simply fired him from his job in 1968 for not fulfilling his duties in the music school. He wanted Bach and Schütz, not higher music. The music school, by the way, still exists, and they teach both higher music and Lutheran church music. So it's time to draw some conclusions. We have been able to trace a clear evolution of the mission administrators and missionaries from the view of the unmusical African to a serious study and appreciation of their music. Thanks to the notes and recordings of the missionaries, we have been able to reconstruct some of the higher music that is now almost entirely extinct. On the other hand, we have also seen that an African bishop, educated in Lutheran music by a missionary, grew to love this repertoire so much that he wanted it sung in his churches. I have no doubt that there are similar stories to be told about other missionaries in other parts of the world. Mission archives, in particular those of the Protestant denominations, are little explored by musicologists and show great promise for future research. These stories must be told and most likely change or refine our understanding of the interactions between indigenous and Western cultures. But in addition, this story throws new light on the history of our discipline. Most striking is that not Hornbostel, but the little-known African music scholar and composer Ballanta profoundly affected the agenda of mission administrators and missionaries. Indeed, he might have achieved more for the higher people with his presentation than Hornbostel did with his African Negro music. Thank you.
Well, this is all fascinating, Anna Maria. Thank you very much. Was Ballanta the first to transcribe inflections? Did Wallachek also?
No, I think you are right. Wallachek did this.
Wallachek in the primitive music.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. But he was not in Berlin, so I concentrate more on the Berlin. But absolutely, the Vienna one, they worked more with the Catholics. But absolutely, yeah. But I didn't work on that. Sebastian Klotz does. Yeah, yeah.
The floor is open. Yes, Brian.
Thank you so much for that. I have a question about anything you might know or if anything can be known about who Ballanta may have been influenced by, or who we may have been in conversation with in his time in the US, his time in West Africa, that may have influenced his thinking about African music. And I'm thinking particularly of other in the US, if he was in touch with any of Black intellectuals, maybe African American or Caribbean or other Africans, because that is so important in other analyses of Black intellectuals in the 20th century. And then in West Africa, I wonder if anything's known about, was he in touch with people in the cherubim and seraphim churches at all? Which were in the 20s, bringing the African music into churches in places like Nigeria, Sierra Leone.
Yeah, about the African part, there's an excellent scholar in Berlin, Tobias Robert Klein, who's constantly in Ghana, and he might have something about it, but I don't think there's much known. I think he essentially gave up when he was back in Africa. I think there was nothing heard of him anymore. But for his early education, he was educated by missionaries, and he was found to be extremely intelligent and took correspondence course in Durham University. Where's Amanda? Oh, there she is. Yeah, exactly. Your university, but I don't think he was there in person. It was just a correspondence course, and he passed with flying colors, and then he somehow managed to get to America. I think encouraged by these missionaries. What was most touching when I looked at this Guggenheim correspondence, which is huge, is the support he received in America. This Peabody, but not only Peabody, people went out of their way to help him. And when he arrived in New York, there was an article in New York Times, and his research got lots of publicity. I don't think there's any evidence that he had contact with other African scholars or black people. I haven't found anything there.
Are you thinking of people like Du Bois?
Yeah.
No, definitely. There's, maybe he did, but I suspect not. No, I suspect not. I think he was in this higher musical society. I think the fact that his first piece was performed in Boston Symphony Hall, by the way, compositions, I should also say a few words about that. They are completely Western. There's not a trace of and he also wrote an opera, which has been performed by a guy in a small, called Dyke Kiel, in a small Midwestern college. And he sent me this performance. And and I think a woman in Canada has written a dissertation, an African woman, on this opera. And there's not a trace of African music in it. I mean, maybe a little folk tune somewhere, but it doesn't sound African at all. Yeah. So if you ask me, it's a very difficult question. Did he send these recordings to Hornbostel or didn't he? Tobias Klein thinks he did, and they got lost. I think it is possible he didn't, because you see recordings of this kind, this was a treasure, and he felt he is an African, why shouldn't he keep them? Right. Why should, there was only one copy, and Hornbostel, why should Hornbostel have them all? So it is possible that he didn't send them. I wouldn't say that Hornbostel was right. And yeah, it's a complicated case. And the manuscript, I have a copy of it. It is a problematic manuscript. But if I'm a medievalist, I'm a specialist of medieval music theory. They write such nonsense, many of these medieval music theorists. There are only 4 or 5 Tinctores and Franco whom you can take as they are, and you have to read in between the lines. And this is what one might have to do with Ballanta too. One has to be careful with how you read it, but it still has so much information. Yeah. So, Greg.
Thank you, Anna Maria. This is such great work, and we really appreciate you sharing it with us. Just one observation: when I taught at the University of Barcelona over 30 years ago, 2 of my best students were from Bahia.
Oh, really? So they might have gone to the school in Ruia, maybe.
They did.
That's so interesting.
So excellent.
Really?
So
I am so excited to hear that. Yeah.
But I do have a question, and could you help fill in the gap between America and return to Africa? Why did he return, and was it economic or was it political?
No, he returned because he got Guggenheim Fellowships. You see, he got Guggenheim Fellowships to do his research. First one, and then he got a second one. And I think he was supposed to write this book then. And he wrote this book. And then he wanted more money, repeatedly asked for more money. Hornbostel, Peabody, and so on. And there's a long correspondence about this. And there was Jesse Jones, I think he was a guy, an administrator, I think, from the State Department who dealt with Africa. And he was supposed to meet him, and Peabody had asked him to ascertain what is really the reason for Ballanta needing the money. Ballanta was in London then, and Ballanta didn't show up to the meeting. So that, of course, made a very bad impression in America. So I tell you, it's a complicated case, yeah.
But it seems that he may have run out of money in Africa.
Yes,
And so
absolutely.
then he decided to stay.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. He decided he didn't have a choice. He had to stay, yeah.
Yeah, and so of course we can talk about this later. I'm just wondering about whether there were interventions that prevented him from gaining more funding.
Yeah.
The whole thing is in the Guggenheim Code. People, Ballanta, I think Ballanta supported him quite long, until 31, 32 at least. And he supported his mother. He had a wife who eventually died. He supported the whole family. But eventually, when he heard from Hornbostel that he might not have sent the stuff and these horrible reviews, I think that was it. The last review of Herzog is 1939. So I think, and then came the war, and I think, and then Peabody, I think, also died after that. Yeah.
But are there any recordings? All the recordings that Hornbostel talks about that he never received, where are those recordings?
Tobias Klein, that's such a good question. It's the same one I asked Tobias Klein. He looked everywhere, not a trace. But if they should be there, yeah. If he didn't send them, yeah. Nobody knows. Yeah. So Tobias could also not find family members of him anymore. He had no survivors. You cannot imagine how hard it was for me to get these photographs of him. Oh, yeah.
And what would he have used to record? He would have used the same equipment as Lomax's father, for example.
He got he got everything from Hornbostel.
He got everything from Hornbostel.
You see, Hornbostel was really progressive. The museum, anthropology museum, gave a free phonograph to everybody who, all missionaries. Hornbostel contacted all missionaries, colonial explorers all over Germany, and said, make these recordings for me, send them back to me. And that's why Hornbostel was so angry that he didn't get these recordings, because that was the agreement. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for this wonderful keynote. I read the book last year, and this brought back so many details fresh to my mind, and made me think about how you've gone in so many directions. One thing struck me where you talked about the challenges as seen by the missionaries in teaching particular intervals in singing. And this made me wonder about methods of singing, teaching, and
Mhm.
music education
Mhm.
in broad terms. And it actually made me think of a few contrasts or comparisons with other kinds of missionary groups. For example, the Jesuits and Franciscans, who were working centuries earlier, of course, but as Victor's shown in his work on Goa, what the Catholic missionaries did was that they would concentrate on children, and they would build over generations, teaching very receptive and malleable musical minds that children have. This process of transculturation was built in that particular environment, and so that made me wonder. Centuries later, what was the approach here with the teaching? Was it concentrating mostly on adults or on everybody altogether? And I mean, what happened was there was a very deliberate segregation that took place in the Catholic missions. People were removed from one another.
Really?
And, well, boys and girls separated.
I think that's
different spaces. And so I'm just wondering about processes of teaching.
I think they taught both adults and immediately established schools. This was one of the missionaries. They were, of course, wanted to missionarize people, the general population, but they also wanted to educate them. That was the primary and medical treatment. All missionaries had to undergo nursing training and so on. But so the school with the children, they were much more successful with the music than with the adults. So I think within a few generations, they could sing the Western music, and they could sing both Western and local music too. So they had no trouble coordinating both of those. I think that. So I think everything happened, and girls, boys and girls, absolutely. They were when I was as a child in Africa, they were still girls' schools and boys' schools completely separate. I don't think that's it's still the case, actually. Yes, I think they still have in Tanzania, right? They have the separate girls and boys' schools, yeah. At least the mission schools. I don't know if the public schools, I don't know that. No.
Yes.
Thank you. I was thinking a little bit about Amanda's talk in sort of resonating with some of the themes of yours, and especially Herzog's role in kind of mediating what does or does not see the light of day in terms of publication. I'm curious to what degree you see his actions there being kind of typical of that moment historically, and also if in your work otherwise you've seen other instances where Herzog himself ended up, I don't know, doing these same kinds of things with other bits of scholarship that might have otherwise.
Horrible. Alan Robert.
That's what I was trying to get you to say, but anyway.
I was in regular touch with Bruno Netto because he was so helpful for this project from the very beginning. Yeah. But he never would say that Herzog was horrible because he was his advisor. But it was clear that he was horrible. And by the way, another thing which I discovered, Herzog was also part of a Liberia exhibition. So he had interest in African music himself. He was probably highly territorial and so thought probably this native, he wouldn't know what to do. Yeah. But I think there was also there was an article where Ballanta is mentioned by an English scholar. I don't remember his name, but I have it in my book. Who thought it was a tragedy that Ballanta there was no PhD program for Ballanta to get properly educated before he went there. And of course, there wasn't one in America at that point there. So I think that Herzog was really the worst possible choice. I mean,
I think BU was the first, we gave our first PhD in musicology in the 40s, right?
Oh, really? But not ethnic.
No, not but our first PhD.
Really?
Yeah,
I didn't know
the
that.
first.
Yeah.
Princeton, I think, was the second.
Really? BU was the first?
Yeah, and it was to a woman. It was, we had.
That's amazing.
I think I sent you all of our alumni. And
Yeah.
1946.
I don't have it present, but yeah. Isn't it amazing that Herzog Bow as a student like cancels out his anti, his intervention in anthropology, getting away from the evolutionary model, and now we're left with the Hornbostel just because of that serendipity.
Yeah, completely right.
It shows
Yeah.
how much serendipity really shapes our institutions, because I mean, we could have lost Bruno Nettel by not getting him out of Rotterdam, and we could have lost him by not having Herzog. And if others would have gone through, how would our discipline have differently developed?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question, so I have one question and then maybe a follow-up to it, but let me ask a direct question for once, which is, I'm wondering how ethnomusicologists have been engaging with this absolutely brilliant work. The reason I ask is because often we have a knee-jerk association with missionaries as being cultural, musical, harbingers of genocide, canceling out indigenous perspectives. And so that's the question. How can you tell me about how we have kind of engaged with it since you've been doing these types of talks?
People have been very kind. Let me see. There was one instance when I was a fellow in 1915-16 in Berlin, in Wissenschaftskolleg, which is a very good institute of advanced studies, and I gave a big presentation there at the very beginning, and there was a highly aggressive anthropologist there who was just half a year there, and she criticized me for dealing with missionaries at all, that one should ignore them and they're horrible people and so on. But it was she was so stupid. And there's no other way to describe it. There were 38 other fellows who just looked at each other and thought, what is going on? But after that happened, I hadn't yet discovered Ballanta. And I realized then and there that I badly need to look for local, for African scholars, and if I was just praying, I would find some, and I did. But if I think the book would have been much worse if I wouldn't have Ballanta in there,
And you wouldn't have been able to engage
exactly
with the discipline.
That's right.
So it
Exactly.
It
It wouldn't have been, but so it's but it was a good thing that she attacked me like that, because in this way I really knew that I had to do something about it.
Well, I mean, it just occurred to me that the trope of the one good missionary who was all of these wonderful things, working with the minors, it's as if he was like created for to push back.
Right.
But of course, there are individuals in the systems in which they work. But I was interested also in the difficulties with complexity in a couple of different ways. Number one, the ways that the missionaries moved in from the coast to, I assume, find somebody who was easier to convert. I mean, that's just my knowledge from Sumatra. So Islam, particularly, maybe on the coasts of Tanzania, Tanganyika, this movement to go further into the pure regions, which of course we see within the choosing of an ethnographic field site, and with Lomax's discomfort with kind of creolized music. So that's there both for missionaries and for anthropologists, clearly. My assumption is that it is for ease of conversion. Maybe you can tell me.
I think the Lutheran societies went consciously away from the coast because the Dar es Salaam was the center of the colonial, the German government, and they wanted nothing to do. They were very anti-colonial. The Catholics, unfortunately, were not anti-colonial at that point. So they were in Dar es Salaam, and there was a missionary who criticized, a Catholic priest who criticized. It was different. The colonial government was highly critical of one of the local parishioners in Dar es Salaam, and the missionary stood up for this local parishioner, and the Catholics from Germany recalled the missionaries back to Germany. The Protestants would never have done that.
Did the Dar es Salaam mission have more to do with like the outreach to the poor, to the impoverished, to the people who were...
Yes, they did that everywhere. They also were very eager to get people liberated, possibly from slavery and things like that. This was their main mission. But I think they were scared, the Catholic missionaries of the colonial authority, and they did horrible things. I mean, the chapter on the Catholic missionaries is just in my book. It's lots of missionaries were killed in this after this uprising there. Because the local population felt that the Catholic Church sided with the colonial authorities, and some Protestants were also killed, but it was never like this bad. Yeah, never. Yeah. But by the way, the Rheinische Mission is a much darker chapter. They have no sense for local music in Sumatra. There was this. You know that. Yeah. So they were not as progressive as this. The completely different chapter. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
So we have I think some stuff back in the coffee and bananas room. The bananas have been augmented by other types of food. You can also pop out to a convenience store or something if you'd like. We will start up again at 1:15.